a Parliamentarians for Peace program entitled Team Biden Takes the Field in Northeast Asia. Today, we have an expert panel that will review some of the perspectives on the American engagement with South Korea and also the concerns for denuclearization with North Korea. Our host and moderator today is Congressman Dan Burton. He's the international co-chairman of the International Association of Parliamentarians for Peace, which is hosted by the Universal Peace Federation and today is co-sponsored by the Washington Times Foundation. I'm Dr. Michael Jenkins. I'm president of the foundation and also chairman for the UPF. Welcome, Congressman Dan Burton.
Hey, Mike, it's good seeing you. You look very nice today. I like that flag behind you. Very good. Well, I also want to welcome people from around the world to our webcast. This is a very important time. The issue we're talking about today is a very important issue. President Trump, when he was president, worked very hard with Kim Jong-il to come up with some way to solve a lot of the problems in Korea. And now we have President Biden, who sent his Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense over to that area, Japan and Korea, this week. Later this week, they'll be meeting with President Moon, and we hope that has it's a very productive meeting. We're very fortunate to have an old friend of mine as our first speaker. He's been in Congress for a long time. I think he's been there, 20 some years now, since 1994. He looks a lot younger than that, but he's been there since 1994. So he's been there for 24 of those years. Since becoming a member of Congress, he's served on the Committee on Small Business, Judiciary, and the Foreign Affairs Committee, where he's the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Asia, Pacific, Central Asia, and Nonproliferation. He's got a fierce reputation in Congress as a fighter for cutting spending. And boy, if we ever needed him, we need him there now, because the Congress seems to be really running away with, or the government's running away with our spending. So we're great that he's there because he's such a fiscal hawk. He also leads the efforts in Congress to reduce the regulatory burden on small business, which is also very, very important right now. And he's one of the leaders in Congress to combat the opiate crisis, which we all know is a continual problem here in America. And one of the most important things, as far as I'm concerned, he's a strong supporter of the rights of the unborn. And he's even introduced legislation that would ban the practice of partial birth abortions. So Congressman Chabot is one of my heroes. And Steve, you're on. Thank you, buddy. We're waiting on Steve. How are you going to? Is he all hooked up?
We lost connection.
I'm sorry?
I think we lost connection, Congressman.
Oh, you want me to go to the next one?
You lost connection with you.
Yes. Yeah. Go to the next one for now.
No, you're fine, Congressman. Go to Congressman Lim.
Okay. Well, while we're waiting on my good friend Steve, we'll go to Congressman Jong-seong. He's a member of the Korean National Assembly. He's in South Korea right now, and he's getting ready to help receive the U.S. delegation, including the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense. Assemblyman Lim currently is in his second term. His official duties include serving on the Environment and Labor Committee in the National Assembly. In addition, he's a leader of the National Assembly Forum on Climate Change, as well as a financier of the Asia National Assembly Water Consultative Board. So he's not going to be able to be with us in person because he's meeting the American delegation that's coming in. But we do have a statement from him that's videoed, and we're going to present that to you now.
안녕하십니까. 대한민국 국회의원 임종서입니다. 오늘 워싱턴 타임스와 UPF가 주최하는 국제 컨퍼런스에서 대한민국 국회의원을 대표해 발표할 수 있는 시간을 주셔서 감사합니다. 초대해 주신 UPF 토마스 월시 의장님과 마이클 젠키스 회장님, 탐 맥데비 워싱턴 타임스 회장님, 세계평화 국회의원 연합 댄버튼 전 미국 하원 의원님께도 감사드립니다. 특별히 UPF 창설자이신 한학자 총재님께 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 지난 1월 21일 미국에서는 조 바이든 대통령 시대가 열렸습니다. 대한민국 국회의원이자 세계평화 국회의원 연합의 한국 대표로서 굳건한 한미동맹을 강조한 조 바이든 대통령 당선을 진심으로 축하드립니다. 바이든 대통령은 미국이 다시 세계와 협력할 것이며 평화, 발전, 안전을 위해 협력하고 신뢰할 수 있는 파트너가 될 것이라고 천명했습니다. 미국 우선주의를 벗어나 세계 평화와 공동 번영의 길을 선도할 것이라는 그의 취임사는 지구촌에 희망을 주고 있습니다. 한국에서도 바이든 대통령의 외교 정책에 대해 큰 기대를 가지고 있습니다. 특히 외교 안보 라인의 실무 협상을 통해 포괄적인 해법을 찾고자 노력하는 바이든 정부에 감사를 표합니다. 한반도의 완전한 비핵화로 나가고자 하는 외교적 해법을 적극 검토해 주길 기대하고 그 과정에서 과거 미국, 중국, 러시아, 일본, 한국, 북한이 참여했던 육자 회담도 적극 검토할 필요가 있다고 생각합니다. 그러한 관점에서 이번 주 17일에서 18일 예정된 안토니 블링컨 국무장관님과 로이드 오스틴 국방장관님의 방한을 진심으로 환영하며 이번 기회를 통하여 한미 동맹이 동북아와 세계 평화의 핵심 축으로 더욱 굳건해지고 신통일 한국에 물꼬를 트는 계기가 되기를 바랍니다. 한국은 미국과 6.25 한국전쟁 참전국에 대해 늘 감사한 마음을 가지고 있습니다. 그러나 북핵 문제 등 평화로 나아가기 위해서는 중국과의 협력도 필요합니다. 대한민국 국민들은 미국이 중국을 포함한 모든 동북아 국가들과 한반도 문제를 놓고 외교적으로 잘 풀어나가길 기대하고 있습니다. 존경하는 각국 국회의원, 지도자 여러분, 세계적 긴장을 조성하는 북한의 핵 문제가 근본적으로 해결되기 위해서는 국제사회의 적극적인 관심과 협조가 필요합니다. 그런 점에서 2017년 대한민국 국회에서 개최된 세계평화 국회의원 연합 총회에서 113개국 450여 명의 현지 국회의원들이 북한의 비핵화 동참과 평화적 통일을 촉구하는 서울선언문 채택을 해주신 데 대해서도 다시 한번 감사드립니다. 오늘 개최되는 컨퍼런스를 통해 그레고리 믹스 미국 하원 외교위원장님과 스티브 채봇 위원님을 비롯해 세계 각국의 국회의원과 지도자들께서 대한민국이 처해 있는 상황을 이해하고 함께 평화를 향해 나아가는 계기가 되기를 진심으로 바람하지 않습니다. 오늘 뜻깊은 컨퍼런스에 초대해 주신 UPF 측에 감사드리며 UPF가 지향하는 공생, 공영, 공의의 비전이 더 크게 확산되기를 기원드립니다. 대단히 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Assemblyman Kim. We really appreciate you being with us today, and I hope you'll give our best regards to the delegation that's coming from the United States. Next, we have my former colleague, Congressman Chabot. I guess we were having trouble hooking him up before, but he's one of the best members of Congress. He's been there a long time. He really knows how to get things done. So it's my honor to introduce Congressman Steve Chabot.
Thank you, Dan. I assume you can hear me okay?
Oh, you look good.
Excellent. All right, thank you. Well, thank you to the Washington Times Foundation and to the Universal Peace Foundation for allowing me to speak today. It's great to be here with Congressman Dan Burton. He and I served together in Congress for nearly 2 decades. We represented states right next door to each other. I represent Ohio, and Dan, of course, represented Indiana. He was a highly respected, very effective member of Congress. We really do miss him here in Congress, and we could use his experience and leadership in Congress today. There's no question about that. Now, with Secretaries Blinken and Austin's upcoming visit to South Korea tomorrow, this is certainly a timely briefing. As was mentioned, I'm the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific. The ranking member is the lead minority party. And of course, right now, the Democrats are in the majority in the House. I'm a Republican. So we're in the minority. And I'm the lead Republican on that committee. Our subcommittee has really broad jurisdiction. We like to say that covering Asia and Pacific, we cover over half the world's population, over a third of its economic activity, and about half of the surface of the earth. Not only do we cover China, which presents multifaceted challenges, but we also have many allies and partners who are eager for U.S. engagement. The U.S.-South Korea alliance is a very, very important one, and it anchors the U.S. presence in Asia to a considerable degree. So I'm glad to see that President Biden's people are making it a priority by going to South Korea so early in the administration. So I think that's a very positive thing. It reinforces the importance of the U.S. South Korean alliance. I've been closely following and engaged in issues related to both South Korea and North Korea for a long time now, particularly when I was the chairman. I'm now the ranking member, as I mentioned, while I was the chairman of the Asia and Pacific Subcommittee back in 2013 and in 2014 when Republicans were in the majority. And as we now, as we now have a new administration taking over the task of trying to get the North Koreans to give up their nuclear weapons, let's review where we are and how we got here. Previous administrations, both Democratic and Republican, have worked out deals under which Kim regimes, whether it was Kim Jong-un now or his father, where they promised to make concessions on their nuclear programs in exchange typically for food and oil or other things that they wanted. Unfortunately, none of those deals really worked out because the North would at best half-heartedly comply, then break the agreements, typically in secret. They would be doing what they weren't supposed to do secretly, and then ultimately they'd throw out the agreement altogether, cause problems, and then try to get new concessions from the United States. And unfortunately, typically they were successful in getting food or oil, either from the US or South Korea or from our allies. President Trump took a different approach. As we know, he held several meetings face to face with Kim Jong-un, which surprised people, especially the first one. Unfortunately, in the end, it really didn't produce the breakthrough that the Trump administration had hoped for. In the meantime, while Kim has followed a self-imposed moratorium on the nuclear and long-range missile testing, he's continued to build up his nuclear forces. He's conducted shorter-range missile tests, and he's continued to stage cyber attacks against the United States and our allies. That brings us now to the Biden administration. It just came out that this administration has been reaching out to North Korea and has received, at this point, apparently no response, or at least no substantive response. It seems that they're, at this point, kind of in a wait and see mode. Although, as we've mentioned, they are heading to South Korea, tomorrow. So here are a few pieces of advice that I would give to our new president, President Biden, and his administration as he seeks to bring lasting peace to the Korean Peninsula. First of all, peace comes through strength. If we haven't learned anything, I think in history, that's what we, not just the United States, but I think every nation ought to learn, that peace will come through strength. That doesn't mean that there aren't nations that have become strong and abused that strength, but that has not been the pattern of the United States, certainly. President Biden's team needs to shore up the US, Japan, South Korean alliance so that we can present a united front. Of course, that's easier said than done, as these two key US allies, Japan and South Korea, continue to be at odds over issues that go all the way back to the Second World War. And in fact, even earlier, we should also resume our joint military exercises with the South Koreans. I think that was a mistake that President Trump made. I think we should continue that and modernize the military relationship that we have with South Korea. Yes, Kim won't like that, and he sees such exercises as provocative and threatening, but he's the threat, and that's why we need these types of military exercises to be ready in case he ultimately does act erratically and act militarily against the South. And then there's China. China doesn't have complete control over North Korea, but let's face it, they have an awful lot of leverage. We need to get China to use that leverage. Unfortunately, they've acted like they were going to use it, and they've acted like they're cooperating, but they could do far more than they've done thus far. There are several ways that I think that we should consider in getting China to be more cooperative in leaning on or pressuring North Korea to do the things that they ought to be doing. If you want to get serious, for example, with sanctions, we could consider sanctioning China's financial institutions that do business with North Korea. That would certainly get their attention. Or we could reopen talks about, basing additional missile defense systems in Japan or South Korea, something that China doesn't want to see happen. So those are a few things that we could do to put some pressure on China, to put pressure on North Korea. Of course, these steps are in the service of ultimately achieving lasting peace between North and South Korea. Taking any of these steps would probably raise tensions in the short term, but if we really want to solve the problem, we must get Kim to change direction. I'm afraid the alternative may be worse, letting North Korea build up its arsenal until there's no hope of ever bringing down the denuclearization of the peninsula, which is what our goal should always be. And we should, compromise no further than that. And I'll conclude by reiterating that North Korea has bedeviled multiple presidents of both parties for decades now. Whatever course President Biden determines is the best one, he must remember this: not trust, but verify, but distrust and verify. So we need to distrust what Kim Jong-un is going to do and make sure that we're verifying everything that he would ever agree to, because the odds are he's going to break the negotiations, just as he has recently, and just as his father and grandfather routinely did. I wish President Biden the best of luck in navigating the North Korean issue, he's going to need it. So, and I'll conclude there, Dan.
Well, Congressman Chabot, Steve, my good friend, you kind of reminded me a little bit of Ronald Reagan there. You used some of his famous quotes, trust but verify. And I kind of like that. It brings back fond memories that you remember as well.
Yep.
What things do you think are important in dealing with that whole region, including North Korea? I mean, you've got, as you mentioned, China. You've got the South China Sea where China's building those islands and violating a lot of agreements and free shipping there. And you mentioned that their involvement with North Korea not being as strong as it should be. So what other issues do you think we ought to be talking about with North Korea?
Well, I mean, clearly we need to be doing this with our allies, and the Quad, for example, I think is going to be a growing power entity for the U.S. to try to make sure that the policies that we think that are proven policies that'll bring peace to the whole region and keep the shipping lanes open and keep the pressure on China not to act too irresponsibly, although they will. Let's face it, because they're a growing power, and they ultimately want to be the power broker in the region. They're putting pressure, as you mentioned, Dan, on the other countries in the region by first building islands and then militarizing them, and no flight zones, and just a whole range of issues. So we need to be working together with our allies in the region. I always think of I'm a co-chair of many of the caucuses in the around the world, like the Taiwan caucus and the Cambodia caucus. I'm the co-chair of those. I'm also of the Philippines caucus, and I've had them, over the years, come to us and say, you've got to help us with China. They're bullying us. They're pressuring us. And then I think of Subic Bay, pushing us out of there when they had the strongest nation on earth and our naval power there. And then you push us out, and then you want our help. So some of these short-sighted things that some of our allies in the region have done, it makes you scratch your head and wonder why in the world couldn't they see what was coming. But working together with our allies, that's really the key, I think, Dan, to making sure that both China and North Korea, that we can at least keep them in the box for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, Steve, one of the things that you touched on there is something that I know a lot of people are very interested in right now. We have a treaty, an agreement with Taiwan, and China has rattled their swords from time to time about that. Do you have any comments real briefly? I know we're talking about Korea, but Taiwan's another flashpoint over there.
Oh, absolutely. And, there are military experts now saying that they think that China may very well act militarily within the next 5 to 6 years. And that's of great concern to me. The key has to be that if China sees weakness there, I think they will act. And that's why Taiwan needs to modernize its military, and we need to cooperate in that effort. And for a while there, we saw that, especially under former President Ma, they were trying to get closer to China, and there was kind of the opposite of what they needed to do. Now they are getting stronger, and they need to be, because China is they have a larger Navy than the United States does at this point in time, which, as you know, Dan, when we were talking about a 600 ship Navy, and, under Ronald Reagan, you mentioned before, and when you look that we have 300 plus now, well, they have more than us. Now, the quality of ours is far superior to theirs at this point, but they've got huge amounts of money to invest in that. And so they need to, our ally Taiwan needs to make sure that their military is as strong as possible. I think it's less likely that China will act if that's the case. And then I think the strategic ambiguity that the Obama administration had previously pushed about, well, will the United States act or not? If the PRC acted militarily towards Taiwan, that was some way a good policy. I think ambiguity is dangerous. I think we ought to make crystal clear that if they attack Taiwan, that we will be there militarily. I think it's much less likely to happen if they know that that's going to happen. I think that's the way to keep the peace, is to be clear with them that we'll be there.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned all those things. Makes me want to be back there and pat you on the back. One more quick question before we let you go.
Sure.
Kim Jong-il, the father, and Kim Jong-un have made many agreements with the United States and other countries regarding their nuclear program, and they violated every one of them. So, what would you suggest that the new leaders in the administration, Biden administration, what would you suggest they do to make sure that if a new agreement is agreed to, that we don't see another violation?
Well, I think I could almost guarantee that as soon as it's signed, that they're going to look for ways to violate it, and they probably will, as long as China will let them get away with that. So the key to North Korea is China. And this is going to be a little controversial, Dan, but I'll say it because I know you don't mind being controversial sometimes. The thing that scares the PRC, that keeps them awake at night, is a nuclear Japan or a nuclear South Korea. And I'm not suggesting that we ought to assist them in nuclearizing, but what I think we should do is we ought to talk seriously with those two nations about that. That will get China's attention. Because if they're not going to put pressure on North Korea to get rid of its nuclear program, North Korea is a threat to both South Korea and Japan. So they have every right to consider nuclearizing themselves. And I think discussions between the United States and those two countries, serious discussions about the viability of that and how you'd move forward, that'll get China's attention. I think they would lean on North Korea then to back off their program. Some people don't want to, because you're talking about nuclear, proliferation, and we don't want more countries to get nuclear weapons. But I think that's the only way you're probably going to get China to put the pressure on North Korea that it would take to get them to back off their nuclear program.
Well, Congressman Chabot, people around the world who are watching this program, I'm sure they're very impressed with you, as I am, and I wish you the best there. And if we can ever do anything at the International Association of Parliamentarians for Peace, if we can ever do anything to be of assistance to you in your efforts, I hope you'll let us know. Once again,
thank you very much. Thank you. Good to see everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, that was a very nice conversation with Congressman Chabot. He really is a great guy, and he's done an outstanding job. He's got a tough district there in the Ohio area, but he's always done extremely well. Our next speaker is Dr. Alexandre Mansourov. He's an adjunct professor of security studies at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at the Georgetown University in Washington. I see Dr. Kim there. Dr. Kim, how are you? Are you going to be on next? Oh, I'll get you later. Okay, I'll see you later. So anyhow, Dr. Mansourov is going to be our next speaker. He's president and CEO of Great Falls Solutions International, LLC, and a senior associate at Alumna Insight, the founding member of the U.S. National Committee on North Korea. And he's frequently interviewed as an expert on North Korea and Northeast Asia by U.S. and foreign news organizations. So I'm very happy that he's with us today. So Dr. Mansourov will now yield to you, buddy.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. And thank you very much, Dan, for your kind introduction. Also, I'm really grateful to Dr. Michael Jenkins for his kind invitation to participate in this amazing discussion. We have over 134 participants just on the webinar, and I'm sure hundreds more on Facebook. So that's a great audience, and I'm happy to be with you. I'm on the road traveling, so you see this nice background. It's Burton in North Korea. Now, what I'm going to talk a little bit today is the International Security Strategy Guidelines, which were produced by the Biden administration a couple of weeks ago, as well as I'll examine the policy reviews, China, Russia, North Korea, which are underway right now, because they create the kind of policy context for what we're seeing on the ground, and that is the attempts to reset the policies which the Trump administration pursued vis-a-vis, our enemies and allies in the Pacific region. And then finally, I will briefly talk about the expectations regarding the trip by the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense to Asia, which is taking place right now. So let me first highlight some of the major points laid out by the International Security Strategic Guidance, which first of all links foreign policy with domestic policy, kind of talking about the foreign policy for the middle class. This is not a new idea, but the Biden administration decided to put it front and center, promising to rebuild not only American institutions, democratic institutions, American infrastructure back at home, but also to reinvigorate the US alliances as force multipliers and strengthen democratic institutions around the world, democracies around the world. So that's the major theme coming from the Biden White House. The International Security Strategic Guidelines also aim to contain the rival great powers. And we're talking about China and Russia here by countering, quote unquote, the aggression and malign influences. However they want to define them, we're not going to discuss about it, we just don't have time. But for the, that kind of to give you the context of what's going on. And finally, the guidelines, they emphasize climate change and, the defense of human rights around the world as some key priorities, as the other priorities for this administration. Now, at the same time, obviously, the National Security Council is reviewing the US policy towards China, towards North Korea, towards Russia, and towards Iran. So the Quad policy review is underway. And specifically, when we examine what's going on in the China policy review, what's emerging is the emphasis on quote unquote extreme competition with China, which is envisioned by the administration. It also adds a very heavy military component to the US policy, while leaving the door open for limited cooperation in a number of areas, including the climate change, global health, arms control, and non-proliferation. And that's where North Korea fits in. It's regarded as a non-proliferation challenge by the United States. Now, looking at the Russia policy review, what is emerging is, again, great emphasis on stepping up sanctions, pressure to deter the so-called Russian aggression and Russian malign influence, while again, leaving the door open for some limited cooperation on arms control, climate change, and non-proliferation. And that's where North Korean issue fits in. It's a non-proliferation issue where the United States might have some common interest with Russia. Finally, North Korea policy review, which is carried out at the National Security Council now, again, seems to emphasize continued pressure on that country aimed at basically bringing about the denuclearization of North Korea. And, they're talking about exploring various diplomatic paths, how to get there with probably focus on the working level talks at the multilateral, within the multilateral forum. Now, that's, what's happening in the policy world, at least the discussions. But if you look at what's happening on the ground, the reality of it, the envisioned resets of President Biden's policy and strategy in the Indo-Pacific region. Remember, 2 months ago, everybody expected that this president will pursue anything but Trump policy. Now, the reality of the record is a little bit mixed. Instead of the wholesale reset of bilateral relations with China, which was widely expected 2 months ago, now that expectation is fading away. Biden's policy, emerging policy towards China is drifting towards, I would say, an exceptionally hardline policy, especially on the issues where there are conflicts of interest like economy, trade, geopolitical issues, whether it's Taiwan, South China Sea, Hong Kong, Tibet, Xinjiang, South China Sea, Senkaku Islands. So basically, I'd say at this point, it's almost unthinkable to see any revitalization of the US-Chinese strategic partnership. I mean, we moved so far away from that direction. Now, when you look at what's happening with North Korea, that reset, which was expected, anything but Trump, in a way, the Biden administration is backtracking on the denuclearization agreement made in Singapore. Now we're talking about denuclearization of North Korea, not the entire Korean Peninsula, and obviously Pyongyang is not happy about that. The signals from the White House are that we're downgrading the level of diplomatic dialogue with Pyongyang, no longer we're interested in the symmetry with that country. And we've obviously, we restarted military drills and we're putting more pressure in terms of sanctions on North Korea. Now, the unspoken reset with Russia, actually is rather weird. Biden's policy towards Russia appears to be much softer than President Trump's. President Biden is lessening the sanctions pressure. He even reached out and made a deal on the arms control front. Now, I would like to basically say here that, people these days talk about the worsening situation in North Korea. The trade is off, the borders are shut down. We're not sure about the pandemic. So, how should we approach that? And, my opinion is that, the situation in North Korea at this point doesn't really matter whether it's getting worse or, better. Why? Because as the US-Chinese rivalry aggravates, countries in the Pacific region, they will be compelled to take sides. And so the alliances will be tightening, and we see it already with Quad, the US tightening its alliances with Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, etc. And the same, I expect, will happen on the North Korea, Russia, China side. North Korea is going to lean much closer to China, and China is going to stand up and stand by its North Korean ally by increasing its economic support once the pandemic pressure is lifted, by basically relaxing its sanctions and looking the other way. And pretty much I don't expect China to approve any more anti-North Korean sanctions resolutions. And so and that kind of will take away a lot of leverage which the US might have by dangling the carrot of sanctions relief with respect to North Korea.
Yeah.
So those advocates of policy in the US who basically want to step up pressure on North Korea to take advantage of Pyongyang's increasing economic weakness or economic crisis, I think they will be disappointed. Why? Because in my opinion, Beijing is likely to stand by its ally and support it in this new era of the Second Cold War. Whereas the advocates of resuming bilateral assistance, humanitarian assistance to North Korea, against the background of worsening economic situation, I think they will also be disappointed. Why? Because North Korea, A, may insist on decoupling humanitarian assistance from the nuclear issue, and B, it may basically try to link this humanitarian assistance with the broader sanctions relief efforts. And so far, as you heard from Congressman Chabot, North Korean government rejected all the behind-the-scenes efforts by the Biden administration to reach out and establish some initial communication. Why? Not only because Pyongyang does not want to reveal its hand before the North Korea policy review is completed, but I think it's going to play hard to get. It's usual tactics. Obviously, Kim Jong-un is unhappy with the Biden's administration name-calling, trashing Trump's summit diplomacy, repudiating the Singapore Declaration. They don't like it, and we heard, Kim Jong-un's sister yesterday very loud and clear how she expressed, her brother's disappointment with what's going on in this policy review.
Yeah.
Now, the North Koreans basically believe that any American move aimed at increasing strategic deterrence in Northeast Asia will be countered not just by North Koreans, not only by the North Koreans, but also by the Chinese and the Russians. Like, for example, the deployment of additional missile defense assets in Japan or South Korea, or the deployment of an additional aircraft carrier group, or military drills. I mean, the Russians and the Chinese, they will basically counter those moves, and North Korea will be not left alone. So we are going to see a deja vu of the Cold War days, sort of. And plus, remember, the Tokyo Olympic Games are coming, so they don't expect the US really to engage in any saber rattling in the lead up to the Olympic Games, because Pyongyang can reciprocate, in a similar way, believe it or not. Now, in the remaining couple of minutes, let me briefly address the desired outcomes with respect to the visit, Seoul and Japan visit by Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin. Of course, we want to see America back in the region, but more importantly, we want the American enemies and allies to actually believe in it, that America is back, which will restore the international credibility of the United States in the region. Because it's not enough just to say we're back, it's more important for others to believe that indeed we're re-engaged. Number one. Number two, we want to see bilateral alliances strengthened and thorniest, at least the most thorniest issues resolved, like the burden sharing, and we hear that this issue has been settled, at least for the time being. Now, number three, obviously, we want key national security policies of Japan, South Korea, and US aligned and harmonized, especially on how to deal with China, how to deal with North Korean nuclear issue, and that's much more difficult challenge. And finally, we want trilateral coordination between US, South Korea, and Japan to be resumed, whether it's in the framework of the trilateral coordination and oversight group, TCOC 2.0, or whether it's Quad Plus mechanism, whatever form it will take remains to be seen, but that needs to happen for this diplomacy to prove to be successful. Now, it's not easy because this will raise many difficult dilemmas, especially for Seoul, because it doesn't want to antagonize China, and China looms big in all these issues. And so that's difficult. But let me conclude by saying that the bar is really set very low for Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin. And so the visiting friendly Turks, Japan, South Korea, these are friendly countries which the red carpets are rolled out for them. And so it's hard to fail, in my opinion. And if they do, then I believe it will be their fault. And instead of bringing America back, they will put it back in the line, in the back. And that's what we don't want to happen. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Dr. Mansourov. You're a very knowledgeable man in that entire region, and we could listen to you all day. We may have a question at the end if we have time for you, but we really appreciate it. And it looks like you're having a good time.
Yes, absolutely.
Our next speaker is a real good friend of mine, Congressman John Doolittle. He served 18 years in the United States House of Representatives. He's chairman of North America, or on the International Association of Parliamentarians for Peace. And he's just an outstanding fellow. During his time in Congress, he served as secretary of the House Republican Conference, which is one of the highest positions in the Congress. He served as deputy whip and was a member of the Committee on Appropriations and vice chairman of the Energy and Water Subcommittee and co-founder of the Republican Study Committee. He currently heads a governmental relations firm in Washington, D.C. And after John makes a couple of comments, I think we'll go back to Dr. Mansourov because we just had a question come in, which I will ask him. But right now, let me go ahead and talk to John. Could you hang on for a little bit, Dr. Mansourov? if you could just stick around a little bit, we'd appreciate it. Okay, John, there you are, John.
All right, thank you, Dan. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's nice to be part of this important webinar. Well, we've had some excellent speakers with very useful insights, I think, on the problems we face concerning North Korea and its impact on the United States, South Korea, and our other allies. I think Congressman Chabot did articulate something that's an overriding principle that we must all bear in mind and that our countries must pursue, and that is peace is best achieved through strength. I know many in the region would be upset by this, but I personally believe it would be to our advantage, as Congressman Chabot mentioned, for Japan to acquire nuclear weapons. I know that's going to be upsetting to some of even our allies, but we have to realize the tremendous threat to world peace that China poses. And I think increasing the force amongst our allies would be a very, very useful thing. Obviously, that'll be up to Japan first and foremost. And the other thing I would say is another principle besides peace through strength is that in unity, there is strength. We have a powerful alliance between the Republic of Korea and Japan and the United States. And yet two of those allies, Japan and the Republic of Korea, are at loggerheads right now. They need to settle those differences. We need to be unified because the real threat is China. And you heard how they're building up their Navy. They've got a Navy larger than that of the United States. They're building up their air forces. They built these artificial islands trying to dominate the seas surrounding China. This has become a real problem, and frankly, they've gotten away with it so far. So the strength is important to project right now. Taiwan was mentioned. That's another threat. We must defend Taiwan and be strong for them. It's an intractable problem so far in North Korea. I mean, it's been over 70 years since the Korean War began. It's been over 68 years, I think, since the present armistice has been in effect. During this time, why the dictators of North Korea have succeeded in acquiring nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles. They already have these things. Yes, our policy is to have a verifiable denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, but it has proven elusive in terms of our ability to achieve it. One way we can make progress, however halting, is to have unity and pursue peace through the projection of strength. I really think those are the two principles that we have to keep in mind, and I think all of our speakers have really alluded to them. The maintaining sanctions with maximum pressure is the best thing to do. Whether that can happen or not, for the reasons that have been discussed, is a question up in the air. I personally believe it would be a real mistake to go back to the failed policies of the past, which we know didn't work. The multi-party talks, the providing of benefits without performance on the part of North Korea, and sometimes despite their betrayal of their agreements. That kind of behavior on our part cannot be resumed. Those are the thoughts that I have at this point.
Well, John, thank you very much. As always, you're very up on the subjects, and we really appreciate your comments. And I hope to see you real soon, old buddy.
Same here, Dan. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Mr. Guy Taylor. And the question that's been given to me for Dr. Mansourov, we'd like to also have Mr. Taylor maybe comment on. But before that, let me introduce him to say a few words. He's a national security team leader at the Washington Times newspaper, an award-winning correspondent who oversees the Times State Department, Pentagon, and intelligence community coverage. He's frequently appeared on the very popular McLaughlin Group and C-SPAN, and he's been a winner of the 2012 Virginia Press Association Award for his series on political, economic, and security developments in Mexico. So, Mr. Taylor, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much. This has been incredibly interesting so far, and thanks to the Washington Times Foundation, Universal Peace Federation, and International Parliamentarians for Peace, just for the opportunity for me as a daily newspaper journalist in the group here, just to participate in this important discussion. The timing, I think, is really poignant, not only because of the Blinken Austin visit to the region, but also because in this fast-paced world of 24-hour news and everyone running around with a computer in their hand at every minute of the day, this era of hyper communications, opinionated social media, I think it can be easy to forget to breathe and to take a minute to appreciate the basic reality that the United States, the most powerful and biggest economic engine in the world, is right now and will be for another couple of months in a kind of delicate, nuanced, strategic transition period between the Trump and Biden administrations. And that's true with regard to US policy goals and tactics in Northeast Asia. And it's important right now because I think this moment of ambiguity that we're in, and we can all debate how ambiguous it is so far, but it really actually could strengthen the US posture overall. It's not necessarily a weakness because it means everyone else in the region is very much on their toes right now. And that includes China, Japan, North Korea, Russia, and of course, South Korea, in trying to really determine, A, how might they adjust their own postures to match whatever shifts President Biden's team embraces, but then B, is there an opportunity at hand to exploit any potential weakness presented by the US transition? It goes without saying that B is very much true for US adversaries in the region, particularly China and North Korea. But I think we can see, based on signals from the Biden administration so far, that America's vital interests in the region, I don't think, are changing. In other words, Washington's major goals remain what they've been for several years now, with the two most prominent being the pursuit of denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, and then the containment of communist China's rise as an increasingly influential global economic and potentially military power. This has been going on for more than a decade. And I think if we saw anything in the Trump era, it was that President Trump brought Washington to a kind of collective consensus awakening to this China reality. But, look, the style differences from Trump to Biden are going to be possibly, they might be sharp, I think. And I'm going to try and be really brief here and wrap up in about 2 more minutes. Biden is actually, he's so far lifted from the Trump playbook by promoting the Quad alignment between the US, India, Japan, and Australia. I think the goal is to try and rally greater cohesion among Asia's most powerful democracies in confronting and containing China. But we haven't seen yet whether or not Biden's going to be able to do that on a smaller scale in Northeast Asia. I think what we are going to see, and what we see with this trip right now, is this kind of depth of outreach to allies. Where the Trump administration pushed on the Northeast Asian allies, Japan and South Korea, to reckon with the reality of the costs associated with indefinite and large US military footprints in their nations, really pressuring both to pay more to support that presence. The Biden administration is already trying to smooth over quickly any tension on those issues, and taking a more conciliatory posture, both towards Japan and I think we'll see towards South Korea. Actually, we've already seen towards South Korea. And I think the idea is, can we strengthen the US alliance with each? And can we strengthen the trilateral US, Japan, South Korea alliance, which really struggled in recent years amid infighting between Tokyo and Seoul, that I think Biden realizes needs to stop happening. Drilling a little bit further here as I get to my conclusion, into the North Korea issue specifically, I think there's a few things we want to watch for. Thus far, it appears really unlikely that Biden is going to be pursuing the kinds of high stakes direct meetings with Kim Jong-un that President Trump favored. Instead, I think Biden's likely to return to the policy of strategic patience, revolving around efforts to continue isolating Pyongyang through US and UN sanctions, while taking care to avoid rewarding the Kim regime with any major diplomatic overtures. One of the problems with the strategic patience approach is you can sometimes forget that there's an end goal, and it becomes a sort of permanent state of deterrence, which is where we've been for decades on the peninsula. And I think there could be pressure, both from the South Koreans, but also from more hawkish advocates in the United States for some clarity as to how are we going to actually move the ball forward. And I think one of the biggest questions is, how does South Korea really feel about strategic patience? I think there's a real chance that South Korean President Moon Jae-in is going to be pushing on the Biden administration to tolerate a degree of leeway for South Korea to engage more directly and robustly in its own outreach to North Korea, perhaps even with some aid-based or economic incentives to try to convince Pyongyang to join in talks with the South that have been stalled for a few years now. The Moon government was eager to push the so-called sunshine policy approach in recent years, and was kind of held back from it by the Trump administration, which wanted more of like an all or nothing, approach. And it's possible that Moon could be emboldened to push even harder for this conciliatory approach, because I think Moon might believe that he's got a like-minded ally in the Democrat administration in Washington, and also Moon's single 5-year term in office ends next year in 2022, and he may feel that he's got nothing to lose politically on the domestic political front at the moment. So with that in mind, I think we should be watching for signs of whether the Biden and Moon administrations really see eye to eye on public messaging, as well as behind the scenes maneuvering with regard to North Korea. Or are they just delivering public platitudes of unity while actually pursuing misaligned policy tracks? For instance, the Biden administration might turn a blind eye to South Korean Moon Jae-in outreach to Pyongyang, all while Washington suddenly starts really pursuing an increase in sanctions on North Korea, even secondary sanctions, possibly targeting things like Chinese banks doing business with North Korean firms. So this kind of misalignment could be an unfortunate characteristic of a new status quo while the Moon administration finishes out its term in Seoul. But we'll have to wait and see. And we'll have to also watch whether the North Koreans try themselves to shape the new status quo with provocations, missile tests, possibly a nuclear detonation test. And none of this is to mention how the ongoing COVID pandemic, fortunately in the United States, we're starting to see major progress. But how is this ongoing pandemic, which has really ravaged Northeast Asia, how will that continue to impact regional dynamics, limit the travel of diplomats and things like summits from really gaining steam? And I just, with that, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to offer my take and a few observations here. I really look forward to the rest of the discussion. I'm flattered to be in such company.
Well, thank you, Mr. Taylor. It was very, very interesting. Before I go to my good friend and my leader, Dr. Michael Jenkins, I have a question here for Dr. Mansourov or possibly Mr. Taylor. And the question is from Kevin Meyer. He's a former diplomat and a well-respected person in that field. He says, from my perspective, we've mostly had a bipartisan security policy towards East Asia. And this is the question: do you think China, North Korea, South Korea, and Japan understand this, and that the US is serious about the threats from China? So let me go to Dr. Mansourov first, because he's out in the wilds, and then we'll come back to you, Mr. Taylor, if you'd like to respond.
Okay, Kevin, thank you very much for your question. That's a very good question. I think that this used to be the common wisdom that the US foreign policy towards the region was bipartisan, but in the past 4 years, I think that understanding has weakened, and I don't really believe that whether it's Tokyo, Seoul, or other capitals, they believe that any longer. I mean, the Biden administration will have to rebuild that bipartisan consensus and the perception of that in the region. But I'd like to make a point about the discussion of nuclear option with Tokyo and Seoul. I think it's a bad idea. And I dare to disagree with our respected congressman here. And I think it's a bad idea to discuss the nuclear armament of Seoul, Japan, and South Korea for 5 reasons. First, it will not stop North Korea from its nuclear pursuits, because Pyongyang already believes that South Korea and Japan, they have the benefit of the US nuclear umbrella, nuclear deterrent. Number one. Number two, the nuclear arms race will hurt not only the US security, but also the security of its allies in the region. Number three, it will disrupt the global non-proliferation goals pursued by the United States for many decades. Number four, the United States and its allies, they have plenty of non-nuclear weapons, very lethal weapons, high precision weapons, which will basically deter and defeat any North Korean military threat. And number five, China may use it as an excuse actually to start proliferating its own weapons of mass destruction to the other enemies of the United States around the world, which may find, again, detrimental to our national interests. So I think it's a bad idea, and we should not even talk about it in public forum. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Mansourov. That's a great debate issue. We'll have to cover that some other time. But I think your points are very well taken. Mr. Taylor, do you want to make a comment on that?
Sure. I mean, just very briefly, I think it's hard to follow Alex Mansourov. I will say that I think the top leadership, the foreign policy elite in Beijing, as well as the other major capitals, Tokyo, Seoul, believe and know that there's bipartisan agreement in Washington that the U.S. is committed to the region, to the Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, isn't going to leave anytime soon, and is committed to this policy at least of competition, if not perhaps confrontation with China at this point. I think what we forget is there's debate in China, despite it being an autocratic system that doesn't allow much dissent. There is foreign policy debate over whether or not the Americans can be co-opted, perhaps, or whether or not having Democrats in the White House could be easier for Beijing to pursue certain policy goals of its own, or whether or not it might be more difficult if you have an aggressive, hawkish Republican administration. That debate is playing, we forget as Americans, that debate is playing out in Beijing, and we should be aware of it because it affects the it affects the definitions of areas where we might actually be able to have positive diplomacy with China and economic engagement that doesn't just lead us further down a track of confrontation. So, it's an ongoing and developing situation, but it's an very interesting question.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Taylor. Appreciate that those comments from you and Dr. Mansourov. I guess there has been some controversial things said today, and I'm glad that you both have addressed that. Our last speaker is the gentleman who does so much in making sure that we have these webinars. He's my leader and a very good friend, Dr. Michael Jenkins. He's president of the Washington Times Foundation, president of the Universal Peace Federation of North America, chairman of the Washington Times Holdings LLC, that they're owners of the Washington Times. He's also director of the Northeast Asia Peace Initiative and the Middle East Peace Initiative, which he's worked on since the 1980s, and on conflict resolution projects in the Pacific Rim and in Israel and Palestine. How do you ever get any sleep? Is that why you stay up all night doing all this stuff, Michael?
Congressman Burton. Well, a program like today keeps me wide awake. This is really a great assembly of panelists and experts. And the Washington Times Foundation has done quite a number of fact finders to Korea, and many of the panelists today have been with us, including Mr. Taylor. It's been a wonderful learning process. So one of the things I want to underscore that Dr. Mansourov said, I think the alliance between Japan, Korea, and the United States is absolutely critical. And it's not a simple alliance, but just a few years ago, the General Security of Military Information Agreement called GSOMIA was made between Korea, Japan, and the United States, and it allowed for intelligence and military intelligence sharing between the three nations. That changed the whole perspective of how we could move together in unity. And the GSOMIA was threatened a couple of times because of tensions between Korea and South Korea and Japan, which are historical tensions. But America has been right to consider or really urge them to keep the agreement, as did Prime Minister Suga. So we want to encourage the Biden administration to really remain strong. I think what Congressman Chabot said, peace through strength, is really the right policy. Very glad the Biden administration paid attention to India, Australia, Japan, and the United States and South Korea together, but the Quad of the four nations together are really critical to strengthen an alliance that also can balance China. So the key question always with the peaceful reunification of North Korea, which is what we are looking for through our webinars, through our efforts with the UPF, with also the International Association of Parliamentarians for Peace. Our hope and strong commitment is to find a peaceful resolution to this problem. So certainly the relationship between China and the United States is the key point. And that, I think the Trump administration did a magnificent job of really changing the dynamic of that relationship. Some disagree, but the reality is since September 3rd, 2017, there's been no nuclear test by North Korea. That's a serious accomplishment. That's not just something that's something to dismiss. It's real. And I'm very concerned that those tests will resume. I know that our sources are telling us that in North Korea, they're very unhappy about the Biden administration going back towards the, policy of strategic patience. It won't work. It will not work. We need engagement. We support dialogue. That's why our webinars also have representatives from Russia and China at different times. And we also believe in engagement. Many of our great strategic intelligence friends in the United States do a lot with back channel communications. It's so important. And people like the people on this webinar today are so important. Information is so crucial. But we want to encourage the Biden administration. We believe that everything is definitely a bipartisan commitment. There's no weakening of that bipartisan commitment towards Asia. But there is a lot of questions about China's real strategic position. They are not seeking to make friends with America and have a little better economic development. Their understanding is they want to neutralize America in the Pacific Rim and be able to dominate. And that's what we see. That's how we would call it. However, we don't believe in disengaging with China at all. We believe that we should find a way to find peaceful engagement and development. And I think that this next 4 years is really crucial time for whether we will go towards peace or whether it could become a hot situation. The webinars that we're doing is done every Tuesday at 2 p.m. On Korea. Every webinar we do is on Korea now. Our total focus and our expectation is that we are continuing to find some of the great leaders from around the world, and especially from America, to really be able to bring ideas, thoughts, and real relationships to the table that'll help us bring a better friendship, better communication. We really do want to see that 38th parallel eventually dissolve and North and South Korea can be peacefully cooperating, economically developing and become one nation eventually. That's our hope. And I think that's the real deep desire of the Korean people. It's really one people. And that's a desire of our founder, Dr. Hak-Jeon Moon. She wants to see the peaceful reunification. These webinars are certainly helping. Congressman Burton, you did a wonderful job today. Thank you very much to everybody.
Well, before we go, let me just say real quickly I really appreciate you saying what you said about Dr. Hak-Ja-Han Moon. Without her leadership, we wouldn't be having these webinars. And it really is important, especially in the cause for peace. I'd just like to make one real quick comment. I don't know if we have time for any other questions, but the one comment I'd like to make is that I was in Congress for 30 years. And one of the things that I saw regarding North Korea and South Korea and the proposal for reunification was that there was an inconsistent policy from administration to administration. One administration would take one approach, the next one would take another approach. And as a result, we really haven't made the kind of progress that we should. So I would say just to the Biden administration or any administration, let's make sure while we try to work these things out to solve the problems over there, that we keep our policies consistent, that we don't vacillate back and forth, because what that does is it gives those who oppose the United States a lot of room to manipulate. So peace through strength, but also consistency in our foreign policy. And with that, I don't know if we have any further questions. If not, I want to thank you all for being with us today. I want to thank Dr. Michael Jacobs for his comments. And hopefully we'll see you all again in about 1 week. Good night.
Thank you.